Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises? Or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us, just beyond the veil of sleep. Welcome to the dark underbelly of the Belle Epoque, where addiction wore a tiara and destruction. I came wrapped in luxury, am about to reveal a shocking chapter of buried beneath layers European history that's been carefully of aristocratic shame and social propriety. The story of the Morphine brides will shatter everything high you thought you knew about addiction society and the price of perfection. Over the next several videos, I'll take you inside the opulent drawing rooms and private chambers, where Europe's most privileged women slowly destroyed themselves with the very substance their doctors prescribed as medicine. You'll discover how morphine became the secret ingredient in their daily lives, why addictions spread the upper classes, and the devastating consequences that ripped like wildfire through generations of noble families. But first, me paint you a picture of just how widespread this epidemic became. By the 1880s, it's estimated that over 60% of aristocratic women in major European cities were dependent on morphine or its derivatives. We of women are talking about thousands, the most powerful families in Europe, all hiding shameful secret. This the same wasn't just a few isolated cases of wealthy ladies seeking thrills. This was a systematic destruction of an entire social class, orchestrated by the very medical establishment that was supposed to protect them. The Belle Epoque, spanning roughly from 1871 to 1914, was supposed's golden age. Paris was the cultural capital of the world, art flourished like never before, and technological innovations were transforming daily life. The wealthy lived in unprecedented luxury, with mansions that rivaled palaces, and lifestyles that seemed pulled from fairy tales. Yet underneath this GL medical revolution was quietly creating one of history's most devastating addiction, ittering facade, a crisis. Due from opium in 1804, morphine had been isolate, but it wasn't until the invention of their range in the hypodermic 1850s that its true power became apparent. Suddenly, doctors had a miracle drug that could eliminate pain instantly and completely. For the first time in human history, suffering could be erased with injection. The medical, a simple community, hailed it as one of the greatest discoveries in human history, completely unaware they were unleashing a monster. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating and deeply disturbing. The very qualities that made aristocratic women perfect candidates for morphine addiction were the same qualities their society valued most highly. These women were raised to be delicate, sensitive, and refined. They were taught that physical discomfort was beneath their station, and that any form of pain or distress should be immediately addressed by the finest medical care money could buy. When these pampered daughters of nobility experienced their first taste of morphine, whether for childbirth, headaches, or nervous conditions, they discovered something that transcended mere pain relief. Morphine didn't just eliminate their physical discomfort. It transported them to a realm where all the pressures and constraints of their rigidly structured lives simply melted away. For womenless marriages, trapped in love agency over their own lives, morphine offered the ultimate escape. The transformation occasioned by social expectations and denied any real. It would begin with legitimate dual and always elegant medical treatment. Was often Grade A society doctor would prescribe morphine for agonizing pain of childbirth, or for the mysterious nervous conditions that seemed to plague upper-class women with alarming frequency. The initial relief was so profound, so complete, that it seemed almost magical. These women had never experienced anything like it. Born into lives of privilege but also severe restriction, they suddenly beyond the substance that could transport. Within theocating boundaries of their existence discovered a privacy of their luxurious bedrooms. Surrounded by silk chandeliers, they would prepare wallpaper and crystallections with the same meticulous care their Inge pregnancy for theoxicating. The itself became in toilettes. The ritual they applied to their elaborate morning sickness during syringes, delicate silver often crafted by the finest jewed kept, bicamelars and in velvet-lined cases, summed multiple as essential jewelry boxes as their sets, each more women ornate than the last, decorated with precious graved, with their family CR stones and enests. The morph in small line would arrive crystal vials, looking more like expensive perfume than amid this epidemic. It fit into the existing structure women already of aristocratic life. These dangerous drug. What particularly insidious was how perfectly lived, highly regimented existences, with precise schedules for meals, social calls, and entertainment. Adding regular morph routine felt. It became in injections to this natural, the elaborate tea, another ritual of even sophisticate refinement, like they unprepared for what was completely the time formal dinners, the medical establishment of etiquette surrounding ceremonies or the complex unleashed. Doctors genuinely believed they were providing the best possible care for their wealthy, we understand, vocabulary. When concept of addiction as their medical patients, it today simply didn't exist in return patients, requesting medical as evidence of ongoing more morphine. Doctors saw need, not developing dependence. This medical blind spot was sounded by the social dynamics, compratic patients, Aristocrats of treating. These ordinary when people seeking medical care. These were women from families that could make or break a doctor's career with a single word. When a countess complained of persistent pain or nervous exhaustion, no physician dared suggest she might be developing an unhealthy dependence on her medication. Instead, they increased dosages and frequency, inadvertently feeding addictions that would consume blue entiredlines. The symptoms of morphine addiction, when they did become apparent, were often misinterpreted through prejudice about aristocratic femininity. The pale complexion, the dreamy detachment, the delicate constitution that seemed to require constant medical attention. These were already considered hallmarks of refined womanhood. A morphine-addicted duchess looked like exactly what society expected a duchess to look like. Ally beautiful, other ethereally, and perpetually in need of protection and care. The social circles of the European aristocracy created perfect conditions for the epidemic to spread. These women spent countless hours together at salons, garden parties, and elaborate social gatherings. They shared everything: gossip, fashion trends, beauty secrets, and increasingly medical, shared this miracess. Discovered that morphed with her headaches, she naturally Euless Curine help recommendations. When one baron with her closest friends. When a countess found that her daily injections made the tedium of social obligations bearable. Word spread through her circle like wildfire. The dealers who supplied these aristocratic addicts weren't shady characters lurking in back alleys. They were respected physicians, legitimate pharmacists, and sometimes even trusted household whose servants had learned to prepare chain operating instructions. The entire Inge supplied within the bounds of respectable society, making it nearly impossible to recognize the growing crisis for what it truly was. Some most prominent families in Europe began signs of what to show would now recognize as generational addiction patterns. Mothers would introduce daughters to morphine as rite of passage, a sophisticated remedy for the variousments that plagued women of their class. Sisters would share supplies and techniques, turning addiction into a bonding experience. Even morphine. Later grandmothers, who had discovered in life for arthritis or other age-related ailments, became a family unwitting architect's destruction. The economic impact was staggering, remained largely hidden from public view. Though aristocratic families were spending enormous sums on their morphine supplies, often more than they spent on their legendary extravagances or elaborate like jewelry parties. Some families mortgaged properties or sold priceless heirlooms to maintain their supplies, all while maintaining the appearance of continued prosperity. The psychological toll was even more devastating. These women, raised to be ornamental figures in their families' grand narratives, found themselves trapped in a prison of their own making. The very substance that had promised freedom from the constraints of their lives had become the ultimate constraint, demanding their complete submission and destroying their capacity for genuine human connection. And as the epidemic spread and deepened, the first whispers of concern began to circulate in the highest circles of European society. But these weren't conversations about public health or medical ethics. These were worried discussions about family reputations, marriage prospects, and the potential for scandal. The focus remained on managing appearances rather than addressing the underlying crisis. Purrs to desperate cover-ups happened. The transformation from concerned whizzed gradually, then all at once. By the mid-1880s, certain European noble houses had developed elaborate systems to hide their family secrets. Servants were sworn to secrecy with generous financial incentives and threats of permanent banishment from aristocratic employment. Private physicians were retained not just for their medical expertise, eagerness to falsify medical records, but for their discretion and will. The Countess of Bellefonte became one of the most notorious examples of how far these cover-ups could extend. When her addiction progressed to barely function, at point where she could public events, her family hired a team of handlers' maids and disguised as ladied companions. Their sole job was to ensure she appeared coherent during the brief moments when presence. Between society demanded her these carefully orchestrated appearances, she would retreat to specially prepared chambers where she could indulge her addiction in complete privacy. These chambers themselves became works of art in their own right. Wealthy families spared no expense in creating beautiful, comfortable spaces where their addicted relatives could exist without judgment. Rooms were decorated to accommodate the physical limitations that with the finest silks and furnished with custom-made furniture, design compartments forward. Some featured hidden advanced morphine addiction, impossible injection equipment within storing supplies, while others included specially designed furniture that could conceal elegant cabinets and writing desks. The most heartbreaking aspect of this epidemic was how it destroyed the very relationships these women treasured most. Mothers became unable to care for their children, passing them off to nannies and governesses while they disappeared into their private worlds of chemical escape. Marriages crumbled as husbands found themselves living with strangers who bore only physical resemblance to the women they had married. Children grew up in homes where their mothers were physically present but emotionally absent, creating generational trauma that would echo through European aristocratic families for decades. Yet perhaps the most insidious element was how morphine addiction became intertwined with the era's ideals of feminine beauty and behavior. The pale, ethereal appearance of chronic morphine users aligned perfectly with the aesthetic preferences of the time. The dreamy detachment, the delicate movements, the air of otherworldly fragility. These symptoms of severe addiction were romanticized as the epitome of aristocratic femininity. Fashion magazines of the period unwittingly celebrated the morphine look without. They praise understanding its true source, the translucent skin, the hollow cheeks, and the mysterious, distant gaze that characterized women in the advanced stages of addiction. Portrait painters competed to capture this haunting beauty, creating lasting images that would later serve as documentation of one of history's most tragic-to-notice epidemics. The medical began community disturbing patterns by 1880s. The late, but their responses were hampered by the social and of their economic power patients. Dr. Heinrich Mu in Viennale, practicing's most district exclusive, wrote privately to his growing colleague about alarm at the number of aristocratic patients to require who seem increasing doses of morphine forever conditions that should have resolved ago long. His attempts to reduce dosages or suggest alternative treatments were met with threats of professional ruin from powerful families who could destroy his practice a war with. The pharmaceutical still industry, in its relative infancy, found itself in profit. Companies like Merck, an unprecedented position of power, Ank and Bayer, which that their most manufactured morphine and its derivatives discover lucrative customers, were not hospitals or general medical practices, but the private physicians who catered exclusively to Europe's wealthiest families. Orders from these sources were enormous, consistent, and paid for without question. Some entrepreneurial pharmacists began creating specialized products specifically for this affluent market. They developed morphine solutions in elegant crystal bottles, 8-injection, designed or look sets that like jewelry than medical equipment, and even more created flav that colored preparations to be taken orally by women complications who had developed from excessive injection use. These products were marketed not as medicine, but as luxury items essential for the refined lifestyle. The social rituals surrounding morphine use became increasingly elaborate and formalized. Some aristocratic circles developed their own etiquette around sharing supplies and techniques. There were unspoken rules about when and where injections could be administered, how to prepare the solution, and even to how to gracefully excuse oneself from social obligations when the drug's effects made coherent interaction impossible. The Duchess of Ravenna hosted what became known as morphine sal gatherings, where women could elegant indulge their addictions in a socially acceptable setting. These events were disguised as afternoon tea parties or literary, but their true purpose was to provide a safe space discussions for aristocratic women to use prog consequences. The Duchess herself had morphine without fear of judgment or social rest to such she maintained severe addiction that she required function actions every few hours to butt the facade of hosting sophisticated cultural events. These salons became breeding grounds for the epidemic's spread. Young wives and daughters, dyed by the morenity displayed ease, would be curious about the mysterious Sed-a-ten experience gradually introduced to morphine use. The process was always presented as sophisticated and medicinal, with experienced users sharing their knowledge about proper dosages injection techniques and how's effects in erratic morph situations. The economic social, the drug to manage developed around Aristoc, that ecosystem was Stein addiction, ribbing the basic distributors and press supply chain of manufacturers, agering in its scope and sophistication, beyond entire shadow industry physicians and the addictions of Europe's wealthiest women. Specialized seamstresses created clothing with hidden pockets, and Enable emerged to support compartments for carrying-ers, crafted elaborate pieces that can't supplies, jeweled tiny vials or syringes. Even furniture makers designed custom. The psychological manipulation compartments for storage pieces with secret employed by suppliers was particularly sophisticated. They understood that there were not typical drug aristocratic clients by despy seekers motivation. These were women who valued exclusivity, quality status above all else, and social suppliers positioned morphine as a luxury item available only to the most refined and discerning customers, scarcity suggesting. They created artificial that only the most elite clients could access the purest, most effective 1880s progressed into preparations. As the 1890s, the first generation of children raised in morphine-addicted households, high up in environments began to reach grown where reality adulthood. These young people constantly was where their altered, exist mothers in states of chemical alteration, and where family were increasingly resources alerted toward maintaining addictions, rather than nurturing healthy relationships. Some of these children develop own addictions. Introduced to morphine as teenagers, blindly believed they were sharing mothers who genuinely something beneficial ivly controlling. Others became obsessed, determined to prevent the chaos they had witnessed from repeating in their own lives. Still others retreated into themselves, developing the emotional detachment necessary to survive in households where genuine become impossible. The RIP human connection Happel effects extended far beyond individual high families. European society which had always operated according to carefully maintained networks of relationships and obligations, began to fracture as frac addiction made reliable social interaction increasingly difficult. Traditional matchmaking became complicated when potential would-only brides. Might addictions that be hiding severe become apparent after marriage? Business strained when partnerships between aristocratic families grew. Key decision impact was equally impaired to function effectively. The cultural patronage that had defined profound. The arts makers were too. The Belle Epoque began to suffer as wealthy patrons became too absorbed in their addictions to maintain their previous levels of engagement. Some of Europe's most important cultural institutions found their funding streams disrupted when their traditional supporters either died from overdoses or became too impaired to manage their financial affairs effectively. Yet even as the crisis deepened, the conspiracy of silence remained largely intact. The same social mechanisms that had enabled the epidemic's initial spread now served to hide consequences from public view. It's devastating the press played a crucial role in maintaining this wall of silence. Newspaper livelihoods depended on maintaining GU editors and journalists understood that their L families who formed their relationships with the aristocratic primary readership and advertising base. Stories about morphine addiction among the nobility were systematically suppressed, buried beneath society pages filled with glowing accounts of charity galas and cultural events hosted by the very women whose lives were being destroyed by their dependencies. When occur from deaths die over reframed as tragic doses, they were carefully accidents or mysterious illnesses that struck down delicate constitutions. The obituaries read like poetry, describing women too soon by who had been taken their ethereal natures, their souls too pure for the harsh realities of earthly existence. The romantic language masked the brutal reality of addiction, were related deaths, that's most becoming increasingly common in Europe's prestigious families. Dr. Marie-Claire Dubois, one of the few female physicians practicing in Paris during this period, began keeping detailed private records of what she was witnessing among, discovered her aristocratic patients. Her journals decades later revealed the true case's scope of the epidemic. She documented injections, every of women requiring 2 hours just to function, mothers who had forgotten their children's names, and wives who had become completely unable to recognize their own husbands during periods of withdrawal. What made Dr. Dubois' observations particularly valuable was her unique position as both an insider and an outsider, as she was granted a woman's access to the private spaces where aristocratic ladies felt comfortable revealing their true conditions. Yet, as a physician from a middle-class background, she maintained the clinical objectivity necessary to recognize for the crisis what it truly was. Her notes, elaborate, described deception schemes where families would rotate between different physicians to obtain multiple prescriptions, ensuring a steady avoiding supply while suspicion from any single medical. The international provider nature of European aristocracy created perfect conditions for the epidemic to spread across borders. When French countesses travelled to Vienna for the season, they brought their social habits and suppliers with them. German baronesses visiting London would introduce their English methods, or preparation more potent form counterparts to new elations. The cosmopolitan lifestyle that defined European nobility became the vehicle for a continent-wide health crisis. Royal courts became particularly dangerous environments for the spread of morphine addiction. The intense of pressure court life, with its elaborate protocols and constant scrutiny, made the escape offered by morphine irresistibly appealing to women who found themselves trapped in roles they never chose. Court physicians, eager to maintain favour with powerful families, became unwitting enablers of addiction on a massive scale. The Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known for her obsessive pursuit of beauty and her struggles with depression, became one of the most prominent examples of how morphine addiction could flourish even at the highest levels of society. Though official records were carefully sanitized, private correspondence and medical notes suggest that her increasingly erratic behavior and extended absences from public life were directly related to her dependence on morphine and other opiates prescribed for her variousments. Her ale influence on fashion and beauty standards inadvertently promoted the morphine aesthetic throughout European high society. When the Empress appeared at court events with her characteristic pale complexion and dreamy expression, it set trans-ratic women rush to that other aristocrat. They had no way of knowing they were copying the physical manifestations of severe drug addiction. The technological advances of the Belle Epoque should have improved medical understanding and treatment options, instead made the addiction crisis worse. The development of more refined injection techniques allowed for higher doses and more frequent administration. New chemical processes created purer, more potent forms of morphine that intensified both the initial euphoria and the eventual dependency. Private laboratories, funded by wealthy families desperate to find solutions for their addicted relatives, began experimenting with different delivery methods. Some created time-release preparations designed to provide longer-lasting effects with fewer injections. Others developed flav solutions that could be disguised oralized as medicine for other conditions. These innovations, meant to help, actually made addiction more convenient and harder to detect. The economic ecosystem supporting aristocratic morphine addiction grew increasingly sophisticated and profitable. Entire supply chains developed to serve this lucrative market, from specialized glassblowers who created elegant storage containers to skilled craftsmen who designed furniture with hidden compartments. The profits were enormous, as wealthy clients paid premium prices without question and required regular, predictable resupply. Some of the era's most prominent jewelry houses began creating pieces specifically designed to conceal drug paraphernalia. Elaborated tiny compart brooches containments for morphine vials, while ornate rings featured hidden chambers for storing POW. The sedared preparations pieces became status symbols within addicted circles, allowing women to carry their supplies while maintaining appearances of refined elegance. The domestic staff employed by aristocratic families found themselves in positions as the addiction crisis deepened. Maids and valets were often the first to recognize the severity of their employers' conditions, yet they were bound by strict codes of loyalty. Illing accomplices prevented them from seeking help. Many and discretion that became UNW, learning to prepare injections, manage withdrawal symptoms, and maintain the elaborate deceptions necessary to hide the truth from the outside world. Some servants developed their own addictions after gaining access to their employer's supplies. Others suffered psychological trauma from witnessing the slow destruction of families they had served for generations. The most trusted domestic staff members often found themselves wielding enormous power within households, as their discretion and assistance became essential for maintaining family secrets. The legal system remained completely unprepared to address the growing crisis. Morphine addiction was not recognized as a medical condition requiring treatment, nor was it considered a criminal matter requiring intervention. This legal vacuum allowed the epidemic to flourish unchecked, with no mechanisms in place to protect vulnerable individuals or hold suppliers accountable for the consequences of their actions. When legal issues did arise, they typically centered around property disputes and inheritance questions. Families struggled to determine how to handle financial affairs when primary decision-makers were too impaired to function effectively. Some appointed trusted relatives or advisors to manage estates, while others simply allowed financial chaos to develop, alongside the personal destruction caused by addiction. The religious establishment, which might have provided moral guidance or spiritual support, largely failed to recognize or address the crisis. The Catholic Church's emphasis on suffering as a path to spiritual growth made it difficult for religious leaders to understand addiction as anything other than a moral failing. Protestant denominations, while less focused on suffering, were equally unprepared to provide meaningful assistance to families dealing with addiction. Some progressive religious figures did begin to recognize patterns of destructive behavior among their aristocratic parishioners, but their attempts to intervene were often met with resistance from families more concerned with protecting putations than addressing underlying their problems. The social power wielded by wealthy families made it nearly impossible for religious leaders to challenge their behavior directly. As the 1890s progressed, the first whispers of scientific understanding about addiction began to emerge from medical communities in Germany and Austria. Researchers started to recognize that morphine dependency medical condition rather than a moral failing, but this knowledge remained confined to academic circles and had little impact on actual treatment practices. Dr. Friedrich von Wilhelm Hermann, working in Berlin, conducted some systematic studies of the early Stein addiction among the condition aristocratic patients. His findings suggested was far more widespread and severe than anyone had previously imagined. He estimated that morphine addiction affected nearly 3/4 of upper-class women in major European cities, making it one of the most significant public health crises in human history. However, Dr. von Hermann's research faced enormous obstacles in terms of publication and dissemination. Medical journals were reluctant to publish findings that might offend their wealthy readership, while professional medical societies worried about the potential impact on their members' practices. The research existed, but it remained hidden from both the public and most medical practitioners who could have used it to improve their treatment approaches. The international conferences medical of the 1890s began to feature private, invitation-only sessions where physicians could discuss the morphine epidemic among their aristocratic patients. These gatherings operated under strict confidentiality agreements, allowing doctors to share experiences and treatment strategies without risking their professional relationships with powerful families. These confidential medical revealed the true global discussion scope of the crisis. Physicians from Rome, London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin all reported similar patterns of widespread morphine addiction among their wealthiest patients. The consistency of reports across different countries and medical systems made it impossible to dismiss the epidemic as isolated incidents or regional problems. The treatment approaches discussed at these private medical conferences were primitive and often counter-modern standards. Most productive by physicians still believed that gradual withdrawal was impossible. Erratic women, whose for Aristoc delicate constitutions supposedly could not withstand the physical stress of reducing their morphine intake. Instead, they focused on managing addiction symptoms and preventing overdoses while maintaining the social facades that families demanded. Some innovative physicians began experimenting with alternative approaches, including the use of other substances to ease withdrawal symptoms or the development of structured environments where addicted women could receive care away from their usual social pressures. However, these experimental treatments were available only to the wealthiest families and often proved ineffective in addressing the underlying psychological and social factors that had contributed to addiction in the first place. The morphine epidemic had begun to create its own culture within European aristocratic society. Addicted women developed their own language, rituals, and social hierarchies based around their shared experiences with the drug. This subculture provided a sense of community and understanding that many women had been unable to find in their traditional social circles, but it also served to normalize and perpetuate destruct. The artistic behaviors and literary output of the Belle Epoque began to reflect the influence of widespread morphine use, though often in coded or symbolic ways that protected the reputations of those involved. Paintings featured ethereal women with the characteristic pale, dreamy appearance of chronic morphine users. Literature explored themes of escape, transformation, and the blurred boundaries between reality and fantasy that resonated deeply with addicted readers. Some of the era's most celebrated artists unknowingly documented the morphine epidemic through their work. The pre-Raphaelite movement's long obsession with pale-skinned women perfectly captured the aesthetic of chronic morphine use. Countless artists, like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, painted portraits of women whose hollow cheeks, distant gazes, and translucent skin bore all the hallmarks of severe addiction. These paintings, celebrated as masterpieces of romantic idealization, were actually clinical documentation of one of history's most devastating health crises. The fashion industry responded to these changing beauty standards by creating designs that accommodated the physical limitations imposed by advanced morphine addiction. Corsets were redesigned with hidden supports to help women maintain their posture despite muscle weakness. Elaborate sleeves concealed injection sites, while high necklines disguised the telltale marks that accumulated around the throat, and décolletage, where had run women of viable out-injection sites on their arms. Jewelry designers created pieces that served dual purposes, functioning both as status symbols and practical tools for addiction management. Ornate lockets contained tiny compartments for morphine powder, while decorative bracelets featured hidden needles disguised as ornamental elements. These pieces became coveted items within addicted circles, passed down through generations of women as both inheritance and introduction to family secrets. The music of the period began to reflect the dreamy, otherworldly state that characterized morphine intoxication. Composers created pieces with flowing gnotic mel, hypades that perfectly matched the drug's effects on consciousness. Private salons featured musical performances specifically designed to enhance the morphine experience, with carefully compositions chosen that seemed to transport listeners to the enormous realms beyond industry recognize. The pharmaceuticals' earthly concerns profit potential in afflu's serving thisant market and began developing increasingly sophisticated products tailored specifically for aristocratic consumption. Companies created premium formulations marketed not as medicine, but as lifestyle enhancements for discerning women of quality. Elaborate in these products came packaging that resembled luxury cosmetics more than medical supplies, complete with detailed instructions for achieving optimal effects while maintaining social appearances. Private clinics began emerging across Europe, marketed as exclusive retreats for nervous disorders, but actually serving as luxury facilities where wealthy women could manage their addictions in comfortable, discreet environments. These establishments charged enormous fees for services that amounted to little more than supervised drug use in elegant surroundings. The medical staff were at these facilities often more concerned with maintaining client satisfaction than addressing addiction issues. The Countess of Montclair established one of the most notorious of these facilities in a converted chateau outside Paris. Marketed as a rest cure for exhausted nerves, the facility actually functioned as a high-end drug den, where aristocratic women could indulge their morphine dependencies without fear of social judgment. The daily routine included elaborate injection ceremonies conducted in beautifully appointed rooms, with staff members trained to prepare and administer drugs with the same precision and attention to detail typically reserved for formal tea services. The international nature of European high society meant that these facilities attracted clients from across the continent. Russian princesses travelled to Switzerland for treatment that actually enabled their addictions, while English duchesses sought care in German spas that specialised in morphine management rather than recovery. The movement of addicted aristocrats across borders helped spread both the epidemic and increasingly sophisticated methods for maintaining dependencies while preserving social appearances. The domestic arrangements within aristocratic households evolved to accommodate the increasing severity of family members' addictions. Entire wings of mansions were redesigned as private sanctuaries where addicted women could retreat from social obligations. These spaces featured specialized furniture designed to support bodies weakened by chronic drug use, along with discrete storage systems for maintaining adequate supplies of morphine and injection equipment. Household staff developed elaborate systems for managing daily routines around their employers' addiction needs. Meal schedules were adjusted to account for periods when drug effects made eating impossible, while social calendars were carefully managed to ensure that public appearances occurred during optimal phases of the addiction cycle. The most trusted servants learned to recognize the signs of impending withdrawal and could prepare appropriate interventions to embarrassment. The children prevent social growing up in these households developed their own with mother-soaping mechanisms for dealing who were physically present but emotionally unavailable due to chronic intoxication. Some became exceptionally self-reliant, learning to manage adult responsibilities at young ages. Others retreated into fantasy worlds that provided escape from the unpredictable reality of life with addicted parents. Educational arrangements for aristocratic children were disrupted, as mothers became unable to fulfill roles in overseeing their offspring's development. Private tutors and governesses found themselves taking on parental responsibilities far beyond their original duties, often becoming the primary emotional anchors in children's lives. Some of these caregivers developed deep attachments to their charges, creating surrogate family relationships that provided stability in otherwise chaotic households. The marriage market among European nobility became increasingly complicated as families struggled to conceal addiction issues that could destroy matrimonial prospects. Elaborate deception schemes were developed to present potential brides in the best possible light during courtship periods. Some families employed teams of handlers to ensure that addicted daughters appeared coherent and healthy during crucial social interactions with potential suitors. Prenuptial negotiations began to include discreet inquiries about family medical histories, though these discussions remained carefully coded to avoid explicit acknowledgement of addiction issues. Experienced matrimonial brokers developed skills for reading subtle signs of drug dependency, while families invested heavily in temporary rehabilitation efforts designed to improve their daughters' appearances during crucial courtship phases. The wedding ceremonies themselves often required careful orchestration to accommodate brides whose conditions made traditional celebrations impossible. Some ceremonies were moved to private chapels where guest lists could be strictly controlled, while others featured abbreviated services designed to minimize the time that impaired participants needed to maintain social performances. The honeymoon period following these arranged marriages frequently revealed the true extent of addiction issues that had been concealed during courtship. New husbands found themselves married to women whose primary relationships were with their drug supplies rather than their spouses. Some sought annulments or separations, while others resigned themselves to marriages that existed primarily on paper. The financial implications of supporting aristocratic morphine addictions were staggering and often hidden from family patriarchs who controlled estate finances. Women developed elaborate schemes for diverting household funds toward their drug purchases, sometimes collaborating with corrupt servants or suppliers who were willing to falsify bills for other expenses. Some sold family heirlooms or jewelry pieces, replacing them with convincing replicas that could fool casual observers. The most desperate cases involved women who mortgaged properties or took loans against future inheritances to maintain their morphine supplies. These financial arrangements were often concealed through complex legal mechanisms that prevented family members from discovering the true extent of debts being accumulated. Some aristocratic houses unknowingly teetered on the brink of bankruptcy while maintaining appearances of continued prosperity. Insurance companies began recognizing patterns of unusual claims from aristocratic families, but lacked the medical knowledge to understand what they were witnessing. Policies covering medical expenses showed dramatic increases in pharmaceutical costs, while life insurance claims began featuring suspicious patterns of deaths among young aristocratic women. However, the social power wielded by these families made it impossible for insurance companies to investigate too closely without risking their business relationships. The legal profession developed specialized practices around managing the affairs of impaired aristocratic clients. Lawyers learned to conduct business during optimal phases of their clients' addiction cycles, while developing document preparation processes that could accommodate clients whose cognitive abilities fluctuated dramatically. Some legal firms employed medical consultants who could advise on timing meetings and negotiations around their clients' drug schedules. Estate planning became particularly complex when dealing with families affected by morphine addiction. Traditional inheritance structures assumed rational decision-making capabilities that were often compromised by chronic drug use. Some families established trust arrangements designed to protect assets from impaired family members, while others developed elaborate guardianship systems that could function even when primary beneficiaries were unable to manage their own affairs. The international diplomatic community began noticing changes in the behavior of aristocratic families who had traditionally played important roles in European politics and international relations. Embassy social functions became more challenging to manage when key attendees might be impaired by drug use, while traditional diplomatic marriages between noble houses became complicated by addiction issues that could affect political alliances. Some diplomatic families developed their own support networks for managing addiction-related challenges while maintaining their public responsibilities. These informal systems included discreet medical providers who could travel internationally, along with trusted staff members who specialized in maintaining social appearances during official functions. The most sophisticated operations resembled intelligence networks with multiple layers of security designed to protect family secrets that could have international political implications. The religious communities that served aristocratic families found themselves in increasingly difficult positions as the morphine epidemic deepened. Traditional pastoral care approaches proved inadequate for addressing addiction issues, while the social power of affected families made direct confrontation impossible. Some progressive clergy members began developing discreet counseling approaches, but these efforts remained limited by the lack of medical understanding about addiction as a treatable condition. Church records from the period show increasing numbers of requests for private religious services conducted in family homes rather than public venues. These arrangements often reflected families' needs to accommodate members who were too impaired to participate in traditional worship services. Some churches developed special protocols for providing sacraments to homebound parishioners whose conditions were actually related to drug addiction rather than conventional illnesses. The charitable activities that had traditionally occupied aristocratic women began to suffer as addiction made sustained engagement impossible. Philanthropic organizations found their most generous supporters becoming increasingly unreliable, with donation patterns that reflected the erratic nature of addiction cycles rather than consistent charitable commitment. Some charities developed strategies for working around these challenges, including the establishment of trust funds that could provide steady support, even when donors were unable to participate actively. The art patronage that had defined cultural life during the Belle Epoque experienced similar disruptions. Private collections suffered as addicted owners sold pieces to fund their drug purchases, while traditional salon culture declined as hostesses became unable to maintain the social energy required for successful cultural gatherings. Some of Europe's most important artistic movements found their funding streams disrupted by the epidemic's effects on their traditional supporters. The publishing industry began needs opportunities in serving the recognizing market-dictated aristocratic readers. Books of Ad Dre with Ami, Escape Redius themes found audiences among women whose altered states of consciousness made traditional literature difficult to engage with. Some publishers developed specialized product lines featuring shorter works with simple narratives that could be enjoyed during various phases of the addiction cycle. Private libraries within aristocratic households were reorganized to accommodate the changing reading capabilities of their owners. Complex philosophical and political works gave way to collections focused on poetry, fairy tales, and romantic fiction that complemented rather than challenged drug-induced mental states. Some families employed readers who could provide entertainment during periods when visual processing was impaired by morphine effects. The correspondence networks that had traditionally maintained social connections between aristocratic families across Europe began to break down as addiction made sustained communication increasingly difficult. Letter writing, once a refined art form among educated women, became sporadic and often incoherent as writers struggled with the cognitive effects of chronic morphine use. Some families employed secretaries to maintain correspondence on behalf of impaired relatives, though these arrangements often resulted in stilted communications that lacked the personal warmth that had characterized traditional aristocratic social networks. The seasonal migration patterns of European high society were disrupted as families became reluctant to travel with heavily addicted members. Traditional movements between city residences and country estates or international travel for cultural seasons became logistically challenging when family members required constant access to morphine supplies and medical support. Some families established multiple residences specifically equipped to support addiction management, while others simply withdrew from traditional social circuits entirely. The impact on European cultural development was profound and lasting. The Belle Epoque had represented a pinnacle of artistic and intellectual achievement, but the morphine epidemic undermined the social structures that had supported this cultural flowering. As key patrons and participants became increasingly impaired, the networks of support for artists, writers, and intellectuals began to fragment. The crisis was creating its own momentum, with each generation of affected families passing both addiction patterns and enabling behaviours to their children. The epidemic had evolved from a medical problem into a cultural phenomenon that was reshaping the fundamental character of European aristocratic society. Yet the conspiracy of silence remained largely intact, ensuring that the full scope of the destruction would remain hidden from public view for decades to come. The transformation of European aristocratic society was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or even comprehend. By the mid-1890s, the morphine epidemic had created a parallel universe within the highest circles of society, where reality operated according to entirely different rules and expectations. What had begun as isolated cases of medical dependency had evolved into a systematic reorganization of how entire socialiened. The most classes funk-chilling aspect was how completely normalized the abnormal had become. Young aristocratic women entering society now received informal education about morphine, alongside traditional instruction in languages, music, and deportment. Older female relatives would share knowledge about suppliers, injection techniques, and social management strategies as naturally as they discussed fashion or household management. This passing down of addiction knowledge had become an unspoken rite of passage within certain families. The Baroness von Habsburg became notorious for her elaborate coming-of-age celebrations that served dual purposes. While appearing to be traditional debutante presentations, these events actually functioned as introductions to the morphine-using social circles. Young women would receive their first tastes of the drug during these supposedly innocent gatherings, often disguised as medicine for nervousness or excitement. The Baroness maintained detailed records of which young women showed particular susceptibility to morphine's effects, information that was shared among suppliers looking to expand their client base. These social initiation rituals had become incredibly sophisticated. Experienced users developed elaborate mentorship systems where they guided newcomers through the early stages of addiction. They taught techniques for hiding injection marks, strategies for managing withdrawal symptoms during social obligations, and methods for maintaining functional appearances while heavily intoxicated. Most importantly, they provided emotional support during the psychological transformation that accompanied developing dependency. The mentorship relationships often became more intimate and important than traditional family bonds. Morphine sisters, as they called themselves, developed fierce loyalties based on their shared secrets and mutual dependence for supply and support. These relationships created new power structures within aristocratic society, where influence flowed through addiction networks rather than traditional family or political connections. The male aristocracy found themselves increasingly marginalized within their own households, as their wives and daughters retreated into these morphine-centered communities. Husbands discovered that their spouses' most important relationships were with their suppliers and fellow users rather than their families. Some men attempted to assert control by restricting access to funds or confiscating drug supplies. But these efforts usually backfired spectacularly, driving their wives to more desperate and dangerous behaviours. The Duke of Marlborough's attempt to cure his wife's addiction by destroying her morphine supplies and dismissing all servants who had assisted her resulted in a complete household crisis. The Duchess suffered such severe withdrawal symptoms that she became violent and delusional, ultimately requiring restraint and medical intervention that brought unwanted attention from local authorities. The incident demonstrated how completely helpless even the most powerful men had become when confronted with their families' addictions. Some aristocratic men responded by developing their own dependencies, either from curiosity about their wives' experiences or from desperate attempts to maintain emotional connections within marriages that had been destroyed by addiction. These secondary addictions often proved even more devastating had less social, because men typically support and fewer opportunities for discreet management of their conditions. The business community that served European aristocracy began adapting their practices to accommodate the changing needs of their addicted clientele. Luxury goods manufacturers developed product sign users, including specifically designed for Morph, that could support weak, specially designed furniture-aimed bodies and clothing that concealed the physical deterioration caused by chronic drug use. These adaptations were marketed as innovations in comfort and style rather than medical accommodations. The jewelry industry experienced particular growth as demand increased for pieces that could conceal drug paraphernalia. Master craftsmen competed to create increasingly elaborate and beautiful pieces that served dual functions. Some brooches featured tiny compartments accessible only through hidden mechanisms, while others incorporated functional elements disguised as decorative details. These pieces became status symbols within addicted circles, with the most sophisticated designs commanding prices that exceeded those of traditional precious stone jewelry. Private banking services evolved to meet the unique financial needs of aristocratic drug users. Discreet banking houses developed systems for managing the enormous expenses associated with maintaining morphine supplies, while concealing these costs from family members who might object. Some banks offered specialized loan products secured against future inheritances, allowing addicted clients to maintain their dependencies even when their immediate financial resources were exhausted. The most innovative financial services involved complex trust arrangements that could provide steady funding for drug purchases while protecting family assets from complete depletion. These financial instruments required sophisticated legal expertise and often involved multiple jurisdictions to prevent family members from discovering or interfering with the arrangements. Some of Europe's most prominent banking houses devoted entire departments to serving this specialized market. International trade networks developed to supply the growing demand for morphine and related products among European aristocracy. Smuggling operations became incredibly sophisticated, often involving legitimate businesses as cover for drug distribution. Some of the finest pharmaceutical products available were actually illegal imports that bypassed official medical channels to serve private clients willing to pay premium prices for superior quality and reliability. The Ottoman Empire became a crucial source for high-quality opium derivatives, with established trade routes that had traditionally served legitimate medical markets, being expanded to accommodate the private demands of European nobility. Greek and Italian merchants developed specialized expertise in serving this market, often maintaining multiple identities and business fronts to protect their operations from legal interference. Swiss banking secrecy laws made Switzerland a crucial hub for financing these international drug trade networks. Money could be moved through Swiss accounts without triggering the kind of scrutiny that might expose the true nature of the transactions. Some Swiss banks' needs of European aristocracy that they essentially expertise in developed such related financial serving. The addiction became specialized institutions for managing drug-related wealth. The technological innovations of the late 19th century were increasingly being applied to improve drug delivery and concealment methods. Private laboratories funded by wealthy families experimented with new formulations and delivery systems designed to make morphine use more convenient and less detectable. Some developed slow-release preparations that required fewer injections, while others created flavored solutions that could be consumed orally without the telltale marks of needle use. The most advanced private laboratories employed some of Europe's finest chemists, offering salaries that competed with university positions and pharmaceutical companies. These researchers worked on developing not just better morphine products, but also on creating substances that could counteract withdrawal symptoms or mask the physical signs of chronic drug use. Their work represented some of the most sophisticated pharmaceutical research being conducted anywhere in the world. Photography technology was being adapted to serve the needs of addicted aristocratic families. Professional photographers developed techniques for concealing the physical signs of morphine addiction through careful lighting and positioning. Portrait sessions were scheduled during optimal phases of addiction cycles, and post-processing techniques were employed to minimize the appearance of weight loss, skin discoloration, and other telltale signs of chronic drug use. Some photography studios specialized exclusively in serving addicted aristocratic clients, developing expertise in creating images that maintained family dignity while concealing obvious signs of drug dependency. These studios often employed medical consultants who could advise on optimal timing for sessions, and makeup artists who specialized in concealing injection marks and other physical evidence of addiction. The postal services of major European cities began noticing unusual patterns in mail delivery to aristocratic residences. Packages from pharmaceutical suppliers, often disguised as deliveries of cosmetics or household goods, arrived with suspicious regularity. Some postal workers developed side businesses facilitating these deliveries, ensuring that sensitive packages reached their destinations without arousing suspicion from family members or household staff who might not be aware of recipients' dependencies. Private courier services emerged to serve clients who required absolute discretion in their pharmaceutical deliveries. These services employed trusted messengers who could navigate the complex social hierarchies of aristocratic households, ensuring that morphine supplies reached their intended recipients without detection. The most sophisticated courier operations maintained multiple delivery routes and backup suppliers to ensure uninterrupted service eventuation. The legal system during periods of political upheaval or social disrue remained woefully unprepared to address the complexities created by widespread aristocratic addiction. Courts struggled with cases involving contracts signed by individuals whose mental capacity was compromised by chronic drug use. Property disputes became incredibly complex when key decision-makers were unable to participate meaningfully in legal proceedings due to their impaired conditions. Some legal scholars began recognizing the need for new frameworks to address addiction-related legal issues, but their proposals faced enormous resistance from families who preferred to handle these matters privately rather than through official channels. The development of addiction-specific legal doctrines was further complicated by the lack of medical consensus about whether drug dependency constituted a legitimate medical condition or a moral failing. The insurance industry found itself inadvertently documenting the scope of the morphine epidemic through patterns of claims and policy modifications. Life insurance companies noticed increasing numbers of early deaths among young aristocratic women, while health insurance providers saw dramatic increases in pharmaceutical expenses among their wealthiest clients. However, the social power of these families made it impossible for insurance companies to investigate too closely or adjust their policies based on addiction-related risks. Some insurance companies began quietly developing specialized policies designed to address the unique risks associated with aristocratic drug addiction. These policies offered coverage for discrete medical treatment and rehabilitation services, while providing protection against the financial losses that could result from addiction-related poor decision-making. The existence of these specialized insurance products served as another indicator of how completely the epidemic had penetrated European high society. The educational institutions that served aristocratic children began adapting their curricula and policies to address the realities of students whose home lives were disrupted by family addiction issues. Private tutors developed expertise in recognizing signs of family dysfunction and providing stability for children whose parents were unable to fulfill traditional parental roles. Some educational institutions established boarding arrangements specifically designed to provide refuge for children from addiction-affected families. The most progressive educational approaches involved teaching children practical skills for managing household responsibilities that their parents were no longer capable of fulfilling. Young aristocrats learned financial management, social correspondence, and household administration years earlier than would have been traditional, out of necessity rather than educational philosophy. These premature responsibilities created a generation of young people who were simultaneously sophisticated and traumatized. Religious institutions struggled to provide meaningful support for families dealing with addiction issues while maintaining the discretion demanded by their aristocratic parishioners. Some clergy members developed specialized expertise in addiction-related pastoral care, though their efforts were often hampered by the lack of medical understanding about the nature of drug dependency. The most successful religious interventions involved creating supportive communities that could provide emotional and spiritual resources without requiring public acknowledgement of addiction issues. Private chapels within aristocratic estates became increasingly important as family members became unable to participate in public religious observances. Some families employed private chaplains whose primary responsibility was providing religious services that could accommodate the unpredictable schedules and impaired conditions of addicted family members. These religious arrangements often became the only remaining spiritual connection for individuals whose addictions had isolated them from traditional faith communities. The international diplomatic implications of widespread aristocratic addiction were becoming increasingly apparent as key families involved in European politics found their effectiveness compromised by drug-related impairments. Marriage alliances that had traditionally cemented political relationships became unreliable when one or both parties were struggling with addiction issues. Some diplomatic initiatives failed because crucial negotiations were disrupted by withdrawal symptoms or drug-induced cognitive impairment among key participants. The most sophisticated diplomatic families developed elaborate systems for managing addiction issues while maintaining their political effectiveness. These arrangements often involved multiple family members sharing responsibilities, with backup plans for crucial negotiations and social functions. Some families employed political advisors whose primary responsibility was ensuring that addiction-related problems did not compromise their diplomatic influence. Military families faced particular challenges as addiction issues affected officers' wives and daughters who were expected to fulfill important social roles within military communities. The rigid hierarchies and public nature of military life made it especially difficult to conceal addiction problems, while the stress of military service often exacerbated existing drug dependencies. Some military families found themselves choosing between career advancement and family privacy as addiction issues became harder to hide. The colonial administrations of European powers began experiencing disruptions as aristocratic families involved in colonial governance struggled with addiction-related impairments. Some colonial positions remained unfilled because qualified aristocratic candidates were too compromised by drug dependencies to accept overseas assignments. Other colonial administrators found their effectiveness undermined by addiction issues that made it impossible to maintain the social presence expected of European representatives in colonial settings. The merchant class that supplied goods and services to European aristocracy developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of their clients' addiction-related needs and limitations. Luxury retailers learned to time their sales presentations during optimal phases of their clients' addiction cycles, while service providers developed strategies for managing the unpredictable behavior and altered decision-making capabilities of their addicted customers. Some merchants developed specialized expertise in serving addicted aristocratic clients, creating business models that could accommodate the erratic payment patterns and unusual demands associated with drug dependency. These businesses often required significant financial reserves to manage the irregular cash flows that resulted from their clients' addiction cycles, while maintaining the discretion necessary to preserve valuable aristocratic relationships. The transportation industry adapted to serve the unique needs of addicted aristocratic travelers. Private railway car services developed expertise in providing medical support during long journeys, while carriage makers created vehicles with hidden compartments for drug supplies and equipment. Some transportation companies employed medical personnel who could assist with addiction-related health crises during travel. International travel became increasingly complex for addicted aristocratic families, as they needed to ensure continuous access to morphine supplies while crossing national borders. Some families established supply networks in multiple countries to ensure they could maintain their dependencies during extended international travel. Others simply avoided international travel entirely, limiting their social and business activities to regions where their addiction support systems could function effectively. The construction industry began incorporating addiction-related features into the renovation and construction of aristocratic residences. Hidden passages allowed for discreet movement between rooms during periods when public appearances were impossible. Specialized rooms were designed with features that could support individuals whose physical capabilities were compromised by chronic drug use. Some architects developed particular expertise in creating living spaces that could accommodate the unique needs of addicted families while maintaining the elegant appearances expected of aristocratic homes. The most advanced architectural adaptations involved entire wings of mansions designed specifically for managing family members with severe addictions. These spaces included medical facilities disguised as private libraries or sitting rooms, along with discreet quarters for medical staff and trusted servants. The architectural innovations required to accommodate aristocratic addiction became so sophisticated that they influenced broader trends in luxury home design. The domestic service industry evolved to meet the complex needs of addiction-affected aristocratic households. Specialized training programs emerged for servants who would be working in these challenging environments. These programs taught medical skills for managing addiction-related health crises, discretion techniques for protecting family secrets, and practical skills for maintaining household operations when primary family members were unable to fulfill their traditional roles. The most valuable domestic servants in addiction-affected households were those who could effectively manage the complex logistics of maintaining drug supplies while protecting family reputations. These individuals often wielded enormous influence within their households, becoming trusted confidants and essential facilitators for family members whose addictions had made them dependent on outside assistance for basic daily functions. The epidemic had reached a point where it was creating its own economic ecosystem, with entire industries devoted to serving the addiction-related needs of European aristocracy. The profits generated by this shadow economy were enormous, creating powerful incentives for continued enablement rather than treatment or recovery. The financial interests involved had become so substantial that they represented a formidable obstacle to any potential efforts to address the crisis directly. The social structures that had defined European aristocratic life for centuries were being systematically destroyed and replaced by new networks based on addiction rather than traditional family or political relationships. The morphine epidemic had become a transformative force that was reshaping the fundamental character of European high society in ways that would have profound implications for generations to come. The medical establishment's response to this growing crisis revealed the profound limitations of 19th century scientific understanding. Even as evidence mounted that morphine was creating dependencies rather than curing ailments, the prevailing medical theories of the time prevented doctors from recognizing what they were witnessing. The concept of psychological addiction simply did not exist in medical vocabulary, leaving physicians to interpret their patients' increasing desperation for higher-orsening underlying doses as evidence of W conditions rather than drug dependency. Nanelli, practicing. Doctors Rome. Alessandro Burr, in most exclusive Me district, kept meticulous records that would later provide historians with crucial insights into the medical community's blin unfolding before eyes. His patient theirdness to the crisis frequency. Compal notes describe aristocratic women returning Asians with increasing aning of symptoms that today for consult effects. Yet, Dr. Bertinelli consistently, Asians of heist these complaints as manifest interpreti would be immediately recognized as withdrawal area, rasthenia, or other fash the perioinable diagon. The pharmaceutical nuances of companies producing morphine found themselves in an unprecedented position of influence and profitability. Merck, Bayer, and other major manufacturers discovered that their most lucrative market segment consisted of private physicians serving European nobility. These doctors placed orders that dwarfed those from hospitals and general medical practices, requesting quantities that should have raised immediate concerns about appropriate medical use. The marketing strategies employed by pharmaceutical companies deliberately exploited the social dynamics of aristocratic life. Morphine was promoted not merely as medicine, but as a refined solution for the delicate constitutions of well-bred women. Advertisement materials featured elegant ladies in luxurious settings, suggesting that morphine use was a mark of sophistication rather than medical necessity. These marketing campaigns effectively transformed drug dependency into a status symbol within certain social circles. Private pharmaceutical laboratories began emerging across Europe, funded by wealthy families seeking more potent and refined preparations than those available through conventional medical channels. These facilities employed some of the continent's most brilliant chemists, who worked in complete secrecy to develop products tailored specifically for aristocratic consumption. The research conducted in these private laboratories was often more advanced than work being done in universities or established pharmaceutical companies. The Rothschild family's private laboratory in Vienna became legendary among Europe's addicted aristocracy for producing morphine preparations of unprecedented purity and potency. Their chemists developed innovative delivery methods that could provide longer-lasting effects with fewer injections, along with flavored preparations that could be consumed discreetly during social gatherings. The laboratory's products commanded premium prices and were distributed exclusively through networks of trusted physicians who served the wealthiest families. These private laboratories also pioneered research into compounds that could counteract the visible effects of chronic morphine use. They developed preparations designed to restore color to pallid complexions, strengthen weakened muscles, and improve cognitive crucial function during social appearances. While these products provided temporary cosmetic improvements, they often contained additional addictive substances that further complicated their users' dependencies. The international trade networks supplying Europe's morphine epidemic became increasingly sophisticated and profitable. Established merchant families who had traditionally dealt in luxury goods found that drug trafficking offered margins that exceeded their most profitable, legitimate ventures. These operations required enormous capital investments and complex logistical arrangements, but the returns were so substantial that they attracted some of Europe's most prominent commercial families. The Mediterranean trade routes that had historically carried spices and silk became crucial conduits for opium and morphine flowing from Ottoman territories into European markets. Greek shipping families developed particular expertise in this trade, using their established commercial relationships and knowledge of customs procedures to move drug shipments with minimal risk of detection. Some of these families accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of established banking dynasties. Swiss financial institutions became central to managing the enormous monetary flows generated by aristocratic drug consumption. The banking houses of Geneva and Zurich developed sophisticated systems for laundering drug money through legitimate commercial transactions. These arrangements often involved multiple shell companies and complex international transfers designed to obscure the true source and destination of funds used for morphine purchases. The most advanced money laundering operations involved established art dealers who would purchase valuable paintings and antiquities using drug money, then sell these items to legitimate collectors for clean currency. This process allowed drug suppliers to convert their profits into respectable wealth, while providing addicted aristocrats with methods for converting family assets into morphine supplies without arousing suspicion from relatives or financial advisors. The technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution were increasingly being adapted to serve the needs of the morphine trade. Precision manufacturing techniques developed for watchmaking were applied to creating more sophisticated injection equipment. Steam-powered transportation networks allowed for rapid distribution of supplies across continental Europe. Telegraph systems enabled coordination between suppliers and clients that was previously impossible. Private telegraph companies developed coded communication systems that allowed addicted aristocrats to place orders for morphine supplies without explicit reference to drugs. These codes became so sophisticated that entire conversations about quantities, delivery schedules, and payment arrangements could be conducted using language that appeared to discuss legitimate commercial or social matters. The telegraph operators who handled these communications were often paid substantial bonuses for their discretion. The railway networks connecting major European cities became crucial infrastructure for the morphine trade. Private railway cars were modified with hidden compartments for transporting drug supplies, while railway employees were recruited as couriers and lookouts. Some railway companies developed unofficial policies of non-interference with suspicious shipments when they involved aristocratic passengers, recognizing that their most profitable clientele depended on these discreet transportation services. The construction of luxury hotels across Europe was influenced by the needs of traveling aristocrats who required secure storage for morphine supplies and discreet spaces for drug use. Hotel architects began incorporating hidden compartments and private rooms accessible through concealed entrances. The most sophisticated establishments employed staff members trained to assist with addiction-related needs while maintaining absolute discretion about their guests' activities. The Grand Hotel Europa in Vienna became notorious among Europe's addicted aristocracy for its specialized services and facilities. The hotel's management employed former medical professionals who could provide emergency care during withdrawal episodes while maintaining supply relationships with local pharmaceutical sources. Room service included coded menus that allowed guests to order morphine preparations along with their meals, delivered by staff members who had been sworn to secrecy about their unusual duties. The seasonal migration patterns of European high society were being fundamentally altered by the logistics of maintaining morphine supplies. Traditional movements between city residences and country estates became complicated when family members required constant access to drug sources and medical support. Some families established multiple residences specifically equipped with the infrastructure necessary for managing severe addictions. The Château de Malmaison, purchased by the Duchess of Orléans in 1887, was completely renovated to serve as a retreat for her extended family's morphine dependencies. The chateau featured private medical facilities disguised as libraries and sitting rooms, along with secure storage areas for maintaining large quantities of drug supplies. The household staff included trained medical personnel who could manage addiction-related health crises while maintaining the appearance of operating a conventional aristocratic residence. These specialized residences became gathering points for Europe's addicted aristocracy, functioning as exclusive retreats where families could indulge their dependencies without fear of social judgment or legal interference. The most elaborate establishments featured amenities that rivaled the finest European resorts, combined with medical facilities that could provide emergency care during overdoses or severe withdrawal episodes. The cultural implications apparent in of widespread aristocratic addiction were becoming increasingly the artistic and literary transformation of the period. Writers began an alter exploring themes of escaped consciousness that resonated deeply with readers whose drug use. The symbol own experiences by Chronic were shapist movement in poetry, with its emphasis on dreamlike imagery and otherworldly experiences, provided an artistic framework for expressing the morphine experience without explicit acknowledgement of drug use. The painter Gustav Klimt's later works showed clear influences from the morphine aesthetic that had become fashionable among his aristocratic patrons. His portraits featured women with the characteristic pale complexions, hollow cheeks, and distant expressions that marked chronic morphine users. While these physical features were celebrated as artistic idealization of feminine beauty, they actually documented the physical deterioration caused by widespread drug addiction among his subjects. Musical compositions of the period began incorporating extended, dreamlike passages that perfectly complemented the altered consciousness produced by morphine intoxication. Private concerts in aristocratic salons featured performances specifically designed to enhance the drug experience, with carefully chosen pieces that seemed to transport listeners beyond ordinary sensory experience. Some composers developed reputations for creating music that was particularly suited for morphine-enhanced listening. The opera houses of major European cities adapted their programming and performance schedules to accommodate audiences whose attention spans and cognitive abilities were compromised by chronic drug use. Shorter works became more popular, while traditional full-length operas were often presented in abbreviated versions. Some opera houses offered private box arrangements that allowed addicted patrons to attend performances while managing their drug schedules discreetly. The fashion industry's response to the morphine epidemic was both subtle and profound. Clothing designers began creating garments that could accommodate the physical limitations imposed by chronic drug use while concealing the visible signs of addiction. Corsets were redesigned with additional support structures to help women maintain proper posture despite muscle weakness. Elaborate sleeves and high necklines became fashionable, partly because they concealed injection sites and other physical evidence of drug use. The most innovative fashion houses developed specialized clothing lines, marketed exclusively to aristocratic clients dealing with health challenges. These garments featured hidden pockets for carrying drug supplies, magnetic fasteners that could be operated with weakened hands, and fabrics that could disguise weight loss and skin discoloration. The designs were so elegant and sophisticated that they influenced broader fashion trends throughout European society. Jewelry designers competed to create increasingly elaborate pieces that could serve dual functions as both status symbols and practical tools for addiction management. The most prized pieces featured multiple hidden compartments accessible through complex mechanical systems that required specific knowledge to operate. These jewelry pieces became family heirlooms passed down through generations of women, carrying both material value and the practical knowledge necessary for maintaining morphine dependencies. The Fabergé workshops in St. Petersburg created some of the most sophisticated drug concealment jewelry ever produced. Their pieces featured microscopic hinges and springs that allowed tiny compartments to be concealed within apparently solid metal structures. Some brooches contained complete miniature injection kits, while others featured compartments designed to hold different types of morphine preparations. The craftsmanship required to create these pieces represented the pinnacle of jeweler's art, applied to serving aristocratic addiction. The domestic architecture of aristocratic residences was being transformed by the need to accommodate family members with severe addictions. Architects developed expertise in creating private suites that could function as self-contained environments where addicted individuals could retreat from social obligations. These spaces featured specialized furniture designed to support bodies weakened by chronic drug use, along with discreet medical facilities that could provide emergency care when needed. The most advanced architectural adaptations involved entire wings of mansions designed specifically for managing addiction-related needs. These areas included hidden passages that allowed movement between rooms without being observed by household staff or visitors. Ventilation systems were designed to prevent the odors associated with morphine preparation from reaching other parts of the residence. Some rooms featured specially designed lighting that could minimize the visual impact of physical deterioration caused by chronic drug use. The construction techniques employed in these architectural projects required unprecedented levels of secrecy and discretion. Architects and builders were required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing their work with anyone outside the immediate project. Some construction projects employed workers from different regions who were prevented from communicating with each other about the overall scope of the work being performed. The legal profession developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to managing the affairs of clients whose decision-making capabilities were compromised by addiction. Lawyers learned to schedule important meetings and document signings during optimal phases of their clients' drug cycles, when cognitive function was temporarily improved. Some legal firms employed medical consultants who could advise on timing crucial business transactions around their clients' addiction schedules. Estate planning became particularly complex when dealing with families by affecting addiction. Traditional inheritance structures assumed rational decision-making capabilities that were often compromised by chronic drug use. Some families established elaborate trust arrangements designed to protect assets from impaired family members, while ensuring continued funding for addiction-related expenses. These legal instruments required sophisticated expertise and often involved multiple jurisdictions to prevent interference from disapproving relatives. The banking industry found itself managing increasingly complex financial arrangements designed to support aristocratic drug dependencies while concealing these expenses from family members who might object. Private banks developed specialized services for clients who needed to convert family assets into liquid funds for drug purchases without leaving obvious paper trails. These services often required the creation of shell companies and complex international transfers that could disguise the true purpose of financial transactions. The most sophisticated banking arrangements involved the creation of seemingly legitimate business ventures that actually served as fronts for drug-related financial activities. Some banks established art-dealing subsidiaries that could purchase valuable items from addicted clients at below-market prices, then sell these items to legitimate collectors for clean currency. These arrangements allowed families to liquidate assets for drug money while maintaining plausible explanations for their financial transactions. Insurance companies began recognizing unusual patterns in claims from aristocratic families, but lacked the knowledge to understand what they were witnessing. Life insurance policies showed increasing numbers of early deaths among young aristocratic women, while health insurance claims featured dramatic spikes in pharmaceutical expenses. The social power wielded by these families made it impossible for insurance companies to investigate too closely without risking valuable business relationships. Some insurance companies quietly began developing specialized policies designed to address addiction-related risks, without explicitly acknowledging the nature of the problem. These policies offered coverage for discrete medical treatment and rehabilitation services, while providing financial protection against the poor decision-making that often accompanied severe drug addiction. The existence of these specialized insurance products served as another indicator of how completely the morphine epidemic had penetrated European high society. The international diplomatic community found itself increasingly affected by the morphine epidemic, as key aristocratic families involved in European politics struggled with addiction-related impairments. Traditional marriage alliances that cemented political relationships became unreliable when one or both parties were dealing with severe drug dependencies. Some crucial diplomatic negotiations failed because key participants were unable to function effectively due to withdrawal symptoms or drug-induced cognitive impairment. The most sophisticated diplomatic families developed elaborate backup systems for managing their political responsibilities despite addiction-related challenges. These arrangements often involved multiple family members sharing duties, with contingency plans for crucial negotiations and social functions. Some families employed political advisors whose primary responsibility was ensuring that addiction problems did not compromise their international influence and effectiveness. Military families faced unique challenges as addiction issues affected officers' wives and daughters who were expected to fulfill important social roles within military communities. The rigid hierarchies and public nature of military life made it especially difficult to conceal addiction problems, while the stress of military service often exacerbated existing dependencies. Some military careers were destroyed when addiction issues became impossible to hide from superior officers and military society. The colonial administrations of European powers experienced significant disruptions as aristocratic families involved in colonial governance struggled with addiction-related impairments. Some colonial positions remained unfilled because qualified candidates were too compromised by drug dependencies to accept overseas assignments that would separate them from their supply networks. Other colonial administrators found their effectiveness severely undermined by addiction issues that made it impossible to maintain the social presence expected of European representatives. The merchant classes that supplied goods and services to European aristocracy developed sophisticated understanding of their clients' addiction-related needs and behavioral patterns. Luxury retailers learned to time their sales presentations during periods when their clients' cognitive abilities were temporarily enhanced by optimal drug dosages. Service providers developed strategies for managing the unpredictable behavior and impaired decision-making that characterized their addicted customers. Some merchants built their entire business models around serving the unique needs of addicted aristocratic clients. These businesses required substantial financial reserves to manage the irregular payment patterns that resulted from their clients' addiction cycles, while maintaining the absolute discretion necessary to preserve valuable relationships with powerful families. The most successful merchants in this specialized market often accumulated wealth that rivaled that. The transportation of their aristocratic customers' industry adapted extensively to serve the complex needs of addicted aristocratic travelers who required continuous access to morphine supplies while maintaining social appearances. Private railway companies developed specialized car services that could provide medical support during long journeys, while ensuring absolute privacy for passengers who might experience withdrawal symptoms or other addiction-related health crises during travel. International travel became increasingly problematic for addicted aristocratic families as they struggled to maintain their dependencies while crossing national borders and dealing with different legal systems. Some families established supply networks in multiple countries to ensure continuous access to morphine during extended travel, while others simply avoided international commitments that would separate them from their established support systems for extended periods. The construction industry began incorporating addiction-related features as standard elements in aristocratic residence projects. Architects developed expertise in creating discrete medical facilities that could be disguised as conventional rooms, along with hidden storage systems for maintaining large quantities of drug supplies. The most advanced projects included entire wings, designed specifically for managing family members with severe addictions, while maintaining the elegant appearances expected of aristocratic homes. The epidemic had fundamentally altered the social and economic structures that defined European aristocratic life. What had begun as individual cases of medical dependency had evolved into a systematic transformation of how entire social classes functioned. The morphine crisis was creating new power relationships, economic dependencies, and cultural norms that would reshape European society in ways that extended far beyond the immediate health consequences of drug addiction. The conspiracy of silence that protected aristocratic families from public scrutiny was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the epidemic's effects became more severe and widespread. Yet the social and economic interests that benefited from the crisis had become so powerful and entrenched that they represented formidable obstacles to any potential efforts at intervention or reform. The morphine epidemic had created its own institutional momentum that seemed to resist any attempts at change or control. The transformation was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to fully comprehend or manage. European aristocratic society was being systematically restructured around the needs and limitations imposed by widespread drug addiction, creating a parallel universe where normal social rules and expectations no longer applied. The full implications of this transformation would not become apparent until the crisis had already fundamentally altered the character of European civilization itself. The domestic service industry experienced perhaps the most profound transformation of any sector serving European aristocracy during this period. Household staff found themselves occupying unprecedented positions of power and responsibility, as their employers became increasingly dependent on their assistance for basic daily functions. The traditional hierarchy of aristocratic households was essentially inverted, with trusted servants wielding enormous influence over family decisions and access to resources. The Marquise de Pompadour's household staff developed what became known as the rotation system, where different servants were assigned to manage their mistress during various phases of her addiction cycle. During periods of heavy intoxication, one team would ensure she remained comfortable and hidden from visitors. During withdrawal episodes, another team trained in basic medical care would provide support and monitor for dangerous complications. A third team specialized in preparing her for the brief periods when social were absolutely necessary. These appearances' specialized domestic roles required extensive training and commanded salaries that often exceeded those of professional positions in other industries. The most valued servants were those who could effectively manage medical crises while maintaining absolute discretion about their employers' conditions. Some developed such expertise that they were recruited by other aristocratic families, creating a network of professional addiction management specialists operating within the domestic service industry. The psychological toll on household staff was enormous, as they watched families they had served for generations slowly destroy themselves. Many servants developed their own dependencies after gaining access to their employer's morphine supplies, either through curiosity or as a coping mechanism for the stress of their impossible situations. Others suffered breakdown from the constant pressure of maintaining elaborate deceptions while managing life-threatening medical situations without proper training or support. The most tragic cases involved long-time family retainers who had devoted their entire lives to serving aristocratic houses, only to witness the complete dissolution of the families they had helped raise. Some of these servants became more devoted to preserving family secrets than the family members themselves, continuing to maintain elaborate cover-ups even after their employers had died from overdoses or addiction-related complications. The education system serving aristocratic children underwent radical changes, as traditional family structures collapsed under the weight of widespread addiction. Private tutors found themselves assuming parental responsibilities that extended far beyond academic instruction, becoming the primary stable adult figures in children's lives. Some tutors specialized in working with families affected by addiction, developing expertise in providing emotional support and practical guidance to children whose parents were unable to fulfill basic parental functions. The Governess Guild, an informal network of women who specialized in serving addiction-affected aristocratic families, developed comprehensive training programs for their members. These programs included instruction in recognizing signs of drug overdose, managing household finances when parents were too impaired to handle money responsibly, and providing psychological support to children traumatized by their family situations. The Guild maintained strict confidentiality agreements among its members, ensuring that sensitive information about aristocratic families never became public. Some educational institutions established discreet boarding arrangements specifically designed to provide refuge for children from severely dysfunctional aristocratic families. These schools operated under the guise of providing enhanced academic opportunities, but their real purpose was removing children from toxic home environments while maintaining the social appearances that their families demanded. The most sophisticated arrangements involved elaborate visiting schedules that created the illusion of normal family relationships while minimizing children's exposure to their parents' addiction-related behavior. The religious institutions serving European aristocracy struggled to address the moral and spiritual implications of widespread addiction while maintaining the political and financial support they received from wealthy families. Progressive clergy members began developing specialized approaches to addiction-related pastoral care, though their efforts were severely limited by the lack of medical understanding about the nature of drug dependency and the social pressure to avoid acknowledging the extent of the crisis. Private chaplains employed by individual aristocratic families found themselves in particularly difficult positions, as they were expected to provide spiritual guidance while remaining silent about destructive behaviors that were destroying their employers' lives and families. Some chaplains developed their own substance dependencies as a result of the psychological stress of their positions, while others simply resigned themselves to providing comfort rather than meaningful intervention. The most innovative religious responses involved the creation of discreet retreat facilities where addicted aristocrats could receive spiritual counseling in environments that accommodated their medical needs. These facilities were marketed as exclusive religious retreats for spiritual renewal, but they actually functioned as luxury treatment centers where wealthy clients could attempt to address their addictions without risking their social reputations. The success rates of these programs were generally poor, partly because they focused on spiritual solutions while ignoring the medical aspects of addiction. The artistic patronage system that had defined cultural development during the Belle Epoque experienced severe disruptions as traditional supporters became too impaired to maintain their previous levels of engagement with cultural institutions. Many artists found themselves dependent on patrons whose decision-making abilities were compromised by chronic drug use, leading to erratic funding patterns and increasingly bizarre artistic commissions that reflected their patrons' altered mental states. Some artists developed specialized practices serving addicted aristocratic clients, creating works specifically designed to enhance the morphine experience. These pieces often featured dreamlike imagery and otherworldly themes that complemented drug-induced alterations of consciousness. The most successful artists in this specialized market learned to work quickly during brief periods when their patrons were sufficiently coherent to approve commissions and make payments. The music industry adapted to serve audiences whose attention spans and cognitive abilities were severely compromised by chronic drug use. Composers began creating shorter, more repetitive pieces that could be appreciated by listeners with impaired concentration. Some developed designed to enhanced expertise in creating music specifically drug experiences, with carefully crafted compositions that seemed to transport listeners into ethereal realms that complemented morphine's psychological effects. Private concert series became increasingly popular among aristocratic circles, as these intimate gatherings could accommodate audiences whose behavior might be inappropriate for public venues. Musicians learned to adjust their performances based on their audience's apparent level of intoxication, sometimes extending pieces that seemed to particularly appeal to heavily drugged listeners, while shortening or eliminating complex works that required sustained attention. The publishing industry recognized opportunities in serving the specialized reading needs of aristocratic clients, whose cognitive abilities were altered by chronic morphine use. Publishers developed product lines featuring books with large typefaces, simple sentence structures, and dreamlike narratives that could be enjoyed by readers with impaired concentration and altered consciousness. These publications were often beautifully illustrated with ethereal imagery that complemented the morphine aesthetic. Private libraries within aristocratic households were reorganized to accommodate their owners' changing reading capabilities. Complex philosophical and scientific works were replaced with collections of poetry, fairy tales, and romantic fiction that required minimal cognitive effort, while providing the escapist content that appealed to drug-altered consciousness. Some families employed professional readers who could provide entertainment during periods when visual processing was too impaired for independent reading. The correspondence networks that had traditionally maintained social connections between aristocratic families across Europe began breaking down as addiction made sustained communication increasingly difficult. Letter writing, once considered an essential social skill among educated women, became sporadic and often incoherent as chronic morphine use impaired writers' cognitive abilities and motor skills. Some families employed professional secretaries to maintain correspondence on behalf of impaired relatives, though these arrangements often resulted in stilted communications that lacked the personal warmth characteristic of traditional aristocratic social networks. The most sophisticated operations involved secretaries who specialized in mimicking their employers' writing, the illusion of normal social engagement styles and social perspectives, creating correspondence that maintain of their while concealing the true extent employers' impairment. The seasonal social calendar that had structured aristocratic life for centuries became increasingly difficult to maintain as families struggled with the logistics of managing severely addicted members. Traditional events like hunting parties, cultural seasons, and international gatherings required levels of sustained social engagement that were impossible for individuals whose lives revolved around drug schedules and medical management of their dependencies. Some aristocratic families developed alternative social arrangements that could accommodate their addiction-related limitations, while maintaining appearances of continued social engagement. These might include abbreviated social events scheduled during optimal phases of addiction cycles, or elaborate deception schemes involving hired actors who could represent family members at important social functions when the actual individuals were too impaired to attend. The international marriage market that had traditionally united European noble houses became increasingly complicated as families struggled to conceal addiction issues that could destroy matrimonial prospects. Some families invested enormous resources in temporary rehabilitation efforts designed to improve their daughters' appearances during crucial courtship periods, while others developed elaborate schemes for presenting potential brides during brief periods of relative sobriety. The most sophisticated matrimonial deceptions involved teams of handlers who could ensure that addicted individuals appeared coherent and healthy during crucial social interactions with potential marriage partners. These operations required careful coordination between medical providers, household staff, and family members to create windows of apparent normalcy that could last long enough to secure marriage agreements before the true extent of addiction issues became apparent. The honeymoon periods following these arranged marriages frequently revealed the devastating reality that had been concealed during courtship. New husbands found themselves married to women whose primary relationships were with their drug supplies rather than their spouses, while wives discovered that their husbands had been similarly deceived about their partner's true conditions. Some sought immediate annulments, while others resigned themselves to marriages that existed primarily as social arrangements rather than genuine partnerships. The child-rearing practices of aristocratic families were fundamentally altered by parents' inability to fulfill traditional roles due to their addictions. Children were increasingly raised by professional staff rather than family members, creating a generation of young aristocrats who had minimal emotional connections to their biological parents. Some children developed premature sophistication as they learned to manage adult responsibilities that their parents were too impaired to handle. The most tragic cases involved children who developed their own addictions after being introduced to morphine by parents who genuinely believed they were sharing something beneficial. These parent-child addiction relationships created particularly devastating family dynamics, as children became both victims of their parents' poor judgment and accomplices in maintaining family secrets that prevented them from seeking appropriate help. Educational arrangements for these children often involved elaborate deception schemes designed to conceal family and other parents' dysfunction from teachers. Some families employed tutors who specialized in working with children from addiction-affected households, while others sent their children to boarding schools that could provide stability and structure that was impossible to maintain in chaotic home environments. The financial management systems that had traditionally preserved and transmitted aristocratic wealth across generations began breaking down as addiction impaired decision-making abilities among key family members. Some families established elaborate trust arrangements designed to protect assets from impaired relatives, while others simply allowed financial chaos to develop as addiction took precedence over responsible money management. The most devastating financial consequences involved families who liquidated centuries-old art collections, sold ancestral properties, or mortgaged entire estates to maintain their morphine supplies. These financial decisions were often made during periods of severe impairment, when individuals were incapable of understanding the long-term implications of their actions. Some of Europe's most historically significant properties changed hands during this period as desperate families sold assets to fund their addictions. Banking institutions developed specialized services for managing the financial affairs of clients whose judgment was compromised by chronic drug use. These services often involved appointing trusted advisors who could make financial decisions on behalf of impaired clients while ensuring continued funding for addiction-related expenses. The most sophisticated arrangements included mechanisms for concealing the true extent of addiction-related expenditures from disapproving family members. The legal profession evolved to address the complex challenges created by widespread aristocratic addiction, developing new approaches to contracts, estate planning, and family law that could account for the impaired decision-making capabilities of their clients. Some legal specializations emerged specifically to serve addiction-affected families, with lawyers who understood the unique challenges of managing legal affairs when key parties were unable to participate meaningfully in important decisions. Estate planning became particularly complex when dealing with families where multiple generations were affected by addiction. Traditional inheritance structures assumed rational decision-making capabilities and stable family relationships that were often absent in addiction-affected households. Some families developed innovative legal instruments that could protect assets while ensuring continued access to funds needed for addiction management, creating legal frameworks that essentially institutionalized drug dependency within family structures. The insurance industry found itself inadvertently documenting the scope of the morphine epidemic through patterns of claims and policy modifications that reflected the unusual risks associated with aristocratic drug addiction. Life insurance companies noticed increasing numbers of early deaths among young aristocratic women, while health insurance providers saw dramatic increases in pharmaceutical expenses among their wealthiest clients. Some insurance companies began developing specialized policies designed to address addiction-related risks without explicitly acknowledging the nature of the problem they were addressing. These policies offered coverage for discrete medical treatment and rehabilitation services, while providing financial protection against the poor decision-making that often accompanied severe drug addiction. The development of these specialized insurance products represented another indicator of how completely the epidemic had penetrated European high society. The medical community's response to the growing crisis revealed the profound limitations of 19th century scientific understanding about addiction and drug dependency. Even physicians who recognize their approaches, rather ematic relationships, act the theoretical frameworks necessary to understand addiction with morphine LD, that treatment condition requiring specific as a medical probable patients were developing. The most progressive physicians began developing experimental treatment approaches based on their clinical observations of addiction patterns among their Aristocrats medication management than simply continue hemorrhagic patients. These efforts were severely impaired by the social pressure to maintain patient confidentiality and family reputations, which prevented that might have led to more of open scientific discussion. Effective treatment strategies. Physicians developed specialized practices, some serving only addiction-affected families, though their treatment approaches were often limited to managing symptoms rather than addressing underlying dependency issues. International medical conferences began featuring private sessions where physicians could discuss addiction-related cases without risking their professional relationships with powerful families. These confidential discussions revealed the global scope of the crisis, with doctors from across Europe reporting similar patterns of widespread morphine dependency among their wealthiest patients. However, the comfy nature of these discussions prevented the development of coordinated responses or standardized treatment approaches. The pharmaceutical industry's response to growing demand from aristocratic clients involved developing increasingly sophisticated products tailored for specifically this rative market segment, Luke. Companies invested heavily in research at creating more potent formulations, better delivery methods, and products that could minimize the visible signs of chronic drug use. These innovations were marketed as medical advances, though they often made addiction more convenient and harder to detect, rather than addressing underlying dependency issues. Private pharmaceutical laboratories funded by wealthy families became centers for cutting-edge research into drug delivery systems and addiction management techniques. These facilities employed some of Europe's most talented chemists and medical researchers, who worked in complete secrecy to develop products that could serve their exclusive clientele. The research conducted in these private laboratories was often more advanced than work being performed in universities or established pharmaceutical companies. The international trade networks supplying European aristocratic addiction became increasingly sophisticated and profitable as demand continued to grow throughout the 1890s. established merchant families discovered that drug trafficking offered profit margins that exceeded their most successful legitimate business ventures, leading to the development of complex smuggling operations that could supply high-quality products while minimizing legal risks. The most successful drug trafficking operations involved legitimate businesses that could serve as cover for their illegal activities. Art dealers, luxury goods importers, and international shipping companies all became involved in supplying the aristocratic morphine market. These operations required substantial capital investments and sophisticated logistical coordination, but the profits were enormous enough to attract some of Europe's most prominent commercial families. Swiss banking institutions became crucial to managing the enormous monetary flows generated by aristocratic drug consumption, developing sophisticated systems for laundering drug money through legitimate commercial transactions. These arrangements often involved multiple shell companies and complex international transfers designed to obscure the true source and destination of funds used for morphine purchases, laws. The banking sector that made Switzerland attractive to legitimate wealthy clients also made it ideal for managing the financial aspects of the drug trade. The cultural impact of widespread aristocratic addiction was becoming apparent in the artistic and literary output of the period, though often in coded forms that protected the reputations of those involved. Writers began exploring themes of escape, altered consciousness, and the blurred boundaries between reality and fantasy that resonated deeply with readers whose own experiences were shaped by chronic drug use. The symbolist movement in poetry provided artistic frameworks for expressing the morphine experience without explicit acknowledgement of drug dependency. Visual artists began incorporating elements of the morphine aesthetic into their work, featuring pale, ethereal figures with the characteristic hollow cheeks and distant expressions that mark chronic drug users. These artistic choices were celebrated as innovations in depicting feminine beauty and spiritual transcendence, though they actually documented the physical deterioration caused by widespread addiction among the artist's aristocratic subjects and patrons. The fashion industry's response to changing beauty standards reflected the influence of morphine on aristocratic appearance ideals. Designers began creating garments that could accommodate the physical limitations imposed by chronic drug use while concealing visible signs of addiction. The most innovative designs featured hidden compartments for carrying drug supplies, specialized fasteners that could be operated with weakened hands, and fabrics that could disguise weight loss and skin discoloration. High-end jewelry houses developed increasingly elaborate pieces designed to conceal drug paraphernalia while serving as status symbols within circles. These pieces addicted social, required unprecedented levels of craftsmanship and ingenuity, with microscope that could concopic mechanism seal injection equipment within apparently solid metal structures. The most sophisticated pieces became coveted items that were passed down through generations of aristocratic women as both inheritance and practical tools for maintaining family addictions. The domestic being dances was architecture of aristocratic récits transformed by the need to accommodate family members with severe addictions while maintaining the elegant appearances expected of high society homes. Architects developed expertise in creating discreet medical facilities disguised as conventional rooms, along with hidden storage systems and private passages that could support addiction management while preserving family privacy. The most advanced architectural projects involved entire wings of mansions designed specifically for managing addicted family members. These spaces included specialized ventilation systems to prevent drug-related odors from reaching other parts of the residence, custom furniture designed to support bodies weakened by chronic drug use, and hidden compartments for storing large quantities of morphine supplies and injection equipment. The construction industry developed specialized expertise in serving addiction-affected aristocratic families, with architects and builders who of these challenging projects. These professionals were required to sign extensive confidentiality agreements and often worked under elaborate security arrangements designed to prevent information about had created its projects from becoming public knowledge. The epidemic-owned economic ecosystem, with entire industries devoted to serving the addiction-related needs of European aristocracy. The profits generated by this shadow economy were enormous, creating powerful financial incentives for continued enablement rather than treatment or recovery efforts. The economic interests involved had become so substantial that they represented formidable obstacles to any potential efforts to address the crisis directly. The social transformation was accelerated anyone aiding beyond's ability to control or comprehend fully. European aristocratic society was being systematically restructured around the needs and limitations imposed by widespread drug addiction, creating a parallel social universe where traditional rules and expectations no longer applied. The morphine epidemic had become a transformative force that was reshaping the fundamental character of European civilization in ways that would come. The conspiracy to have profound implications for generations of silence that protected aristocratic families from public scrutiny was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the epidemic effects became more severe and widespread. Yet the social, economic, and political interests that benefited from the crisis had become so powerful and entrenched that they seemed to represent insurmountable obstacles to any potential intervention or reform efforts. The morphine epidemic had developed its own institutional momentum that appeared to resist any attempts at meaningful change or control. The institutional momentum behind the morphine epidemic had become so powerful that it seemed to generate its own gravitational pull, drawing in new victims and creating ever more sophisticated systems of enablement. By the late 1890s, what had begun as individual medical cases had evolved into a self-perpetuating machine of destruction that operated with the precision and efficiency of Europe's most successful industries. The recruitment patterns for new addicts had become systematized in ways that would have impressed military strategists. Established users developed sophisticated methods for identifying vulnerable targets among newly arrived aristocratic families or young women entering society for the first time. These recruitment efforts were disguised as acts of kindness and social inclusion, with experienced addicts offering comfort and solutions, with to newcomers struggling pressures of aristocratic life. The Countess of Bellefontaine became legendary for her ability to identify and cultivate new addicts during social gatherings. She would approach young women who appeared overwhelmed by social expectations, offering private conversations about managing the stresses of aristocratic life. Her drawing room became known as a sanctuary where women could discuss their struggles openly, though these conversations inevitably led to introductions to morph ultimate solution to their problems. The Countine, as the S, maintained detailed records of her recruitment activities, tracking which approaches proved most effective with different types of potential addicts. Sheppy marriages were particularly susceptible during the early months discovered that women trapped in UNH following their weddings, while daughters facing pressure to make advantageous matches could be approached during the social season, when marriage negotiations were most intense. Her methods became so refined that she could predict with remarkable accuracy which women would develop severe dependencies based on their initial responses to morphine. These recruitment networks operated with the sophistication of intelligence operations, with multiple layers of contacts and carefully planned approaches designed to minimize rejection. The risk of detection or successful recruiters developed reputations for their discretion and effectiveness, leading to informal referral systems where established addicts would recommend specific efforts targeting particular individuals for recruitment social circles or family situations. The psychological manipulation employed in these recruitment efforts was particularly insidious because it exploited the genuine vulnerabilities and legitimate complaints of aristocratic women. The restrictive nature of upper-class female existence provided abundant material for arguments about why morphine represented a reasonable response to impossible life circumstances. Recruiters became skilled at presenting addiction as a form of sophisticated rebellion against social constraints rather than medical dependency. The training programs for new addicts had evolved into comprehensive educational experiences that covered every aspect of maintaining a morphine dependency while preserving social appearances. These programs included instruction in injectionage management, withdrawal techniques, DO symptom recognition, and the complex social skills necessary for concealing addiction from family members and social contacts who might disapprove. The Duchess of Ravenna's estate became the site of weekend retreats that functioned as intensive training programs for newly recruited addicts. These gatherings were marketed as exclusive social events for refined women seeking to expand their cultural horizons, but their actual purpose was providing comprehensive education in addiction management. Participants learned everything from proper injection site rotation to prevent visible scarring, to sophisticated scheduling techniques that could maintain optimal drug levels during important social obligations for these training programs high. The curriculum became remarkably sophisticated, incorporating lessons learned from thousands of individual addiction cases. New addicts learned about the optimal timing for different types of morphine preparations, techniques for managing the inevitable progression from occasional use to complete dependency, and strategies for maintaining access to supplies, even medical providers, when family members or attempted to restrict their access to drugs. The most advanced training programs included instruction in financial management techniques that could support long-term addiction without completely depleting family resources. Participants learned methods assets into liqui for converting family funds for drug purchases, strategies for concealing addiction-related expenses within household budgets, and techniques for manipulating family members into providing additional financial resources without revealing the true purpose of their request networks that develop. The support around these training programs created lasting relationships between addicts that often proved more important than traditional family bonds. Women who had attended the same training programs maintained lifelong connections based on their shared knowledge and mutual dependency for emotional support and practical assistance. These relationships created new social hierarchies within aristocratic society, where influence flowed through addiction networks rather than traditional family or political connections. The medical community's complicity in the epidemic had evolved beyond simple ignorance or incompetence into active participation in maintaining the systems that perpetuated widespread addiction. Many physicians had developed financial dependencies on their aristocratic clients that made it impossible for them to provide honest medical advice, even when they recognized the destructive nature of their patients' use. Drug Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann's practice in Vienna became notorious among medical enormous quantities for the colleagues of morphine he prescribed to his aristocratic patients. His income from these prescriptions exceeded that successful of most physicians by such dramatic able-to-purchase margins that he was a mansion in Vienna's most exclusive district and maintain a lifestyle that rivaled that. Of his wealthy clients' financial success attracted other physicians who sought to emulate his approach, creating a network of medical providers who specialized in serving addicted aristocrats. The competition between physicians for access to these lucrative patients led to increasingly aggressive prescribing practices, with doctors offering higher dosages, and some physicians began employ actions to attract clients away from their competitors' more frequent ingeing recruitment agents, who would approach addicted aristocrats with offers of superior products or more, the medical convenience services. Focus on patient professions traditionally Koru welfare was being systemated by the enormous from serving profits available the addiction market. The pharmaceutical companies supplying these physicians developed increasingly sophisticated marketing to encourage higher consumption levels among their aristocratic customers. Strategies designed sales physicians with detailed information about their pricing, competitors' products, and representatives would provide volumes. Some companies develop while offering incentives for increased prescription exclusive relationships with particular physicians, providing them with unique formulations that could not be obtained elsewhere. The research and development efforts of pharmaceutical companies became the addiction market, rather than advancing focused almost entirely on serving legitimate medical knowledge. Resources that could have been devoted to developing treatments for genuine medical conditions were instead directed toward creating more potent morphine preparations and more efficient delivery systems. The scientific advancement that characterized other areas of 19th century medicine was being diverted toward perfecting methods for drug dependency. Private fund laboratories by wealthy families continued to push the boundaries of pharmaceutical innovation in ways that served addiction rather. These facilities employed chemists who developed the medical treatment increasingly pure and potent morphine preparations, along with complementary substances that could enhance the drug, its visible side effects. The most advanced effects or minimized laboratories created custom formulations tailored to the specific needs and preferences of individual clients. The international trade network supporting the developed morphine epidemic had into some of the most sophisticated commercial operations in 19th century Europe. These enormous capital investments, complex logistical coordination, and extensive corruption of law enforcement and customs officials. The profits generated by these operations were so substantial that they attracted investment from some of Europe's most prominent financial institutions. The Mediterranean shipping routes that connected Ottoman opium-producing regions with European markets became crucial infrastructure for the aristocratic drug trade. Greek and Italian merchant families developed particular expertise in managing these supply chains, using their established commercial relationships and knowledge of customs procedures to move drug shipments with minimal risk of detection. Some of these families accumulated fortunes that exceeded those of traditional banking dynasties. The corruption of law enforcement officials became systematic and extensive as drug trafficking organizations invested heavily in ensuring protection for their operations. Police officials, customs agents, and court officials were recruited through a combination of financial incentives and social pressure from efforts involved recruiting families. The most successful corruption-influential aristocratic family members were dependent officials whose own on the services provided by drug trafficking organizations. The legal to address aristocratic addiction create systems inability organizations to operate at opportunities for criminal with virtual impunity within the highest drug levels of European society. Trafficking operations could function openly within aristocratic social circles because the legal framework simply did not recognize addiction as a criminal. This legal matter requiring intervention vacuum allowed criminal enterprises to integrate themselves completely into the social and economic structures of European high society. The international nature of European aristocracy created perfect conditions for drug trafficking organizations to operate across national borders without significant legal impediments. Aristocratic families maintained residences and social connections in multiple countries, providing ideal cover for smuggling operations that could move drugs and money through complex international networks. The diplomatic immunity enjoyed by some aristocratic families created additional protection for criminal activities conducted under the guise of legitimate social and business relationships. The financial institutions that supported these international, legitimate commercial transactions. Swiss operations developed increasingly sophisticated methods for laundering drug money through banks, created complex trust arrangements that could move enormous sums of money through multiple jurisdictions while concealing the true source and destination of funds. These financial instruments were so sophisticated that they influenced the development of modern international banking practices. The cultural impact of the morphine epidemic was becoming apparent in subtle but profound changes to European artistic and intellectual life. The otherworldly aesthetic associated with chronic morphine use began influencing artistic movements that celebrated ethereal beauty and spiritual transcendence. Artists and writers who were not themselves incorporating elements of the morphine aesthetic into Addicted began their work because it had become associated with refined sensibility and aristocratic sophistication. The pre-Raphaelite movement's obsession with pale, ethereal female figures reflected the influence of morphine aesthetics on artistic ideals of beauty. Paintings featuring women with hollow cheeks, translucent skin, and distant expressions were celebrated as masterpieces of romantic idealization, though they actually documented the physical deterioration caused by chronic drug addiction. These artistic works served as inadvertent documentation of one of history's most devastating health crises. Literary movements of the period began exploring themes of escape, altered consciousness, and the dissolution of boundaries between reality and fantasy that resonated deeply with readers whose experiences were shaped by chronic drug use. The symbolist poetry movement provided artistic frameworks for expressing the morphine experience without explicit acknowledgement of drug dependency. Writers developed coded language systems that could communicate about addiction experiences while maintaining plausible deniability about their true subject matter. The music industry adapted to serve audiences whose attention spans and cognitive abilities were compromised by chronic drug use. Composers began creating pieces specifically designed to enhance the morphine experience, with flowing melodies and dreamlike harmonies that seemed to transport listeners into ethereal realms. Private concert series featuring this specialized music became popular among aristocratic circles, though their true purpose was often concealed from family members who might disapprove of their loved one's drug use. The fashion industry's response to changing beauty standards reflected the profound influence of morphine on aristocratic appearance ideals. Designers created clothing that could accommodate the physical limitations imposed by chronic drug use while concealing visible signs of addiction. The most innovative designs featured hidden compartments for drug supplies, specialized fasteners for weakened hands, and fabrics that could disguise weight loss and skin discoloration. These practical innovations were marketed as advances in elegant design rather than medical accommodations. The domestic service changes as household industry experienced fundamental staff found themselves occupying unprecedented positions of power and responsibility within aristocratic families. Traditional hierarchies were inverted as employers on their servants became dependent assistants with basic. The most valued daily functions medical crises maintained those who could manage elaborate dead domestic workers' receptions and provide emotional support to family members whose addictions had destroyed their capacity for normal human relationships. The education system serving aristocratic children was forced to adapt to the reality that traditional family structures had collapsed under the weight of widespread addiction. Private tutors and governesses assumed parental responsibilities that extended far beyond academic instruction, becoming the primary stable adult figures in children's lives. Some educational professionals developed specialized expertise in working with families affected by addiction, creating support systems that could provide stability in otherwise chaotic household environments. The religious institutions serving European aristocracy struggled to provide meaningful guidance while maintaining the discretion demanded by powerful families. Progressive clergy members attempted to develop addiction-specific pastoral care approaches, though their efforts were severely limited by the lack of medical understanding about drug dependency and the social pressure to avoid acknowledging the extent of the crisis. Some religious leaders resigned themselves to providing comfort rather than meaningful intervention, recognizing their powerlessness to address problems that were beyond their theological training and institutional authority. The international diplomatic community found itself increasingly affected by the morphine epidemic as key aristocratic families involved in European politics struggled with addiction-related impairments. Traditional alliance systems based on marriage relationships became family members were unable to fulfill unreliable when their social and political obligations due to drug dependencies. Some crucial diplomatic initiatives failed because key participants were too impaired to engage effectively in complex negotiations. The military establishments of European powers experienced disruption social structures as aristocratic families involved in officer recruitment and military became compromised by addiction issues. Some military positions remained unfilled because qualified candidates were too impaired to accept responsibilities that would separate them from their drug supply networks. Other military families found their effectiveness undermined by addiction issues that made it impossible to maintain the social presence expected within military communities. The colonial administrations of European empires faced significant challenges as aristocratic families involved in colonial governance struggled with addiction-related limitations. Some colonial territories experienced administrative disruptions when key officials were unable to function effectively due to their drug dependencies. The stress of colonial service often exacerbated existing addiction problems, creating a cycle of administrative instability that affected European imperial operations globally. The insurance industry continued to document the epidemic's scope through patterns of claims that reflected the unusual risks associated with aristocratic drug addiction. Companies developed specialized policies to address addiction-related risks without explicitly acknowledging the nature of the problems they were addressing. These insurance products represented another indicator of how completely the morphine epidemic had penetrated European high society, creating new categories of commercial risk that had never before existed. The banking industry's adaptation to serve addiction-affected clients created new financial instruments and service categories that would influence modern banking practices. Private banks developed expertise in managing the affairs of clients whose judgment was compromised by chronic drug use, creating trust arrangements and advisory services that could protect assets while ensuring continued funding for addiction-related expenses. These innovations represented some of the earliest examples of specialized wealth management services designed for clients with specific medical or psychological challenges. The legal profession evolved to address the complex erratic addiction, developing new approaches, challenges created by widespread Aristoc to contract law, estate planning, and family law that could account for impaired decision-making capabilities among clients. Some legal specializations emerged specifically to serve addiction-affected families, with practitioners who understood the unique challenges of managing legal affairs when key parties were unable to participate meaningfully in important decisions. The construction industry developed specialized expertise in creating residential environments that could accommodate the needs of addicted family members, while maintaining the elegant appearances expected of aristocratic homes. Architects learned to design discrete medical facilities, hidden storage systems, and private passages that could support addiction management while preserving family privacy. These architectural residential design, the transportation innovations influenced broader trends in luxury industry, adapted to serve the complex needs of addicted aristocratic travelers who required continuous access to morphine supplies while maintaining social appearances. Railway companies developed specialized services that could provide medical support during long journeys, while ensuring absolute privacy for passengers who might experience addiction-related healthcare travel ICs during. These services represented early examples of medical transportation support systems. The epidemic had created its own institutional momentum that seemed to resist any attempts at meaningful intervention or change. The social, economic, and political interests that benefited from the crisis had become so powerful and entrenched that they represented formidable obstacles to any potential reform efforts. The morphine epidemic had evolved beyond a crisis into a fundamental health restructuring of European aristocratic society that would have profound implications for generations to come. The conspiracy of silence that protected aristocratic families from public scrutiny was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the epidemic's effects became more severe and widespread. Yet the economic ecosystem supporting aristocratic addiction had become so profitable and sophisticated that it seemed capable of adapting to any challenges or threats to its continued operation. The transformation of European high society was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or fully comprehend, creating a parallel social universe where traditional rules and expectations no longer applied. The transformation had reached a point where the morphine epidemic was systematically dismantling the faun, no longer merely destroying individual lives or even entire families. It was dational structures that had defined European civilization, which had served as the cultural for centuries. The aristocratic class, political and economic backbone of the continent was becoming a hollow shell of its former self, maintained only through increasingly elaborate theatricaled to conch within. The most chill the rot performance's designerling development was the emergence of what contemporary observers would later term the morphine dynasties. These were aristocratic houses, other familied down through generations, like any where addiction tradition had become so institutionalized that it was passe. The Duchy of Saxe-Weimar became the most notorious example of this phenomenon, where 4 successive generations of women had been systematically introduced to morphine as part of their coming-of-age rituals. The current Duchess, barely 23 years old, had already progressed to requiring injections every 2 hours to maintain basic functionality. Her daughter, only 8 years old, was already being prepared introduction to THED for her eventual family tradition through carefully orchestrated exposure to the morphine aesthetic and social circles. The Duchess maintained detailed journals documenting the optimal age for introduction, the most effective recruitment techniques, and the family medical history that would guide her daughter's eventual addiction management. These dynastic patterns created multi-generational support networks that were far more sophisticated and resilient than individual grandmothers who had discovered addiction cases. Morphine in their middle age became the architects of family destruction, passing down not only their dependencies, but also the accumulated knowledge and resources necessary to maintain them. These women wielded enormous influence within their families, using their experience and connections to ensure continued access to supplies and medical support for younger relatives. The financial arrangements supporting these dynastic addictions became incredibly complex, involving trust funds specifically established to ensure adequate morphine supplies for future generations. Some families created elaborate legal instruments that could provide steady funding for drug purchases across multiple generations, essentially institutionalizing addiction within their family structures. These arrangements were so sophisticated that they required specialized legal expertise and often involved multiple jurisdictions to prevent interference from disapproving relatives or changing political circumstances. The Rothschild banking house developed particular expertise in managing these multists, creating financial generational addiction true instruments that could operate independently of family oversight, while ensuring continuous funding for drug-related expenses. These trusts were designed to survive political upheavals, economic disruptions, and changes in family leadership, providing steady income streams that could support addiction across centuries if necessary. The banking fees generated by managing these trusts became a significant revenue source for financial institutions specializing in aristocratic wealth management. The recruitment networks operating within European high society had evolved into something resembling religious movements, complete with their own rituals, hierarchies, and belief systems. The most successful recruitment operations developed elaborate initiation ceremonies that transformed morphine introduction into spiritual experiences rather than medical procedures. These ceremonies borrowed elements from various mystical traditions, creating hybrid rituals that appealed to aristocratic women seeking meaning and transcendence within their restricted lives. The Salon of Eternal Serenity, operated by the Countess of Montpellier, became the most famous of these recruitment centers. The Countess had transformed her Parisian mansion into a temple, complete with elaborate dedicated to morphine worship altars where injection ceremonies were performed with religious reverence. New initiates underwent weeks of preparation involving meditation, fasting, and spiritual counseling designed to frame their first morphine experience as a sacred transformation rather than drug consumption. These movements' religious style developed their own theological frameworks that justified and celebrated drug addiction as a higher form of consciousness. Morph was present and used as a method for achieving spiritual enlightenment and transcending the mundane concerns of ordinary existence. The most sophisticated operations employed former clergy members who had left traditional religious institutions to develop new spiritual practices centered around drug-induced, altered consciousness. The theological, religious, various philosophical and movements were remarkably sophisticated, drawing from arguments supporting these traditions to create intellectual frameworks that could justify addiction as spiritual practice. These arguments proved particularly effective with educated aristocratic women who were seeking intellectual as well as emotional escape from their constrained circumstances. The combination of spiritual meaning and chemical euphoria created powerful psychological dependencies that were far more difficult to break than simple physical addiction. The international spread of these morphine cults created networks that transcended national boundaries and traditional political alliances. Aristocratic women traveled across Europe to attend ceremonies and participate in specialized advanced training programs offered by different morphine religious centers. These international connections created new forms of diplomatic and cultural exchange based on shared addiction experiences rather than traditional political or economic interests. The Vatican began receiving disturbing reports about these quasi-religious movements from clergy members serving aristocratic families, but the Church's response was hampered by its dependence on financial support from the same wealthy families that were being destroyed by the epidemic. Some progressive Catholic theologians attempted to develop theological responses to the morphine cults, but their efforts were suppressed by church hierarchies who feared offending powerful donors. The Protestant denominations proved somewhat more responsive to the crisis, with some Lutheran and Reformed pastors developing specialized ministries focused on providing spiritual alternatives to morphine-based religious experiences. However, these efforts remained limited in scope and effectiveness due to the social power wielded by affected families and the lack of medical understanding about addiction treatment approaches. The educational implications of dynastic addiction patterns were becoming apparent as entire generations of aristocratic children grew up in households where drug use was normalized and institutionalized. These children developed fundamentally different relationships with reality, consciousness, and social responsibility than previous generations. Many showed signs of psychological trauma and developmental delays that resulted from growing up in environments where their primary caregivers were chronically intoxicated. Some of the most tragic cases involved children who were deliberately exposed to morphine from very young ages as part of family traditions that viewed early introduction as beneficial preparation for adult life. These children developed dependencies before their personalities and cognitive abilities had fully formed, creating individuals whose entire sense of identity was built around their relationships with drugs rather than human connections or personal achievements. The private educational institutions serving aristocratic families began developing specialized programs designed to address the unique challenges presented by students from addiction-affected households. These programs involved modified curricula that could accommodate students with attention deficits and emotional instabilities resulting from their family environments. Some schools established separate residential facilities where children could be isolated from their family's destructive influences while receiving intensive dial education. The most innovative educational approaches involved creating alternative family structures within school environments, with carefully staffed select members serving as surrogate parents for children whose biological families were too impaired to provide adequate care. These arrangements often became permanent, with children spending their entire childhoods and adolescence in institutional settings rather than returning to their dysfunctional family homes. The cultural productions emerging from addiction-affected aristocratic families began reflecting the profound psychological and spiritual damage caused by institutionalized drug use. Literature written by aristocratic authors showed occupation with themes of increasing and spiritual emptiness, of death, decayness. The romantic idealization that had characterized earlier aristocratic writing was replaced by nihilistic explorations of meaninglessness and despots producere. The visual within these circles began featuring increasingly disturbing imagery that reflected the psychological deterioration of their creators' dyad. Paintings and sculptures created aristocrats or their family members showed obsessions with skeletal figures, decaying flesh, and supernatural horror that contrasted sharply with the elegant beauty traditionally associated with aristocratic artistic production. These works provided stark documentation of the internal experiences of individuals whose outer lives maintained appearances of refinement and compositions emerging sophistication. The morphine brides epidemic stands as one of history's most devastating examples of how privilege and access can become instruments of destruction. What began as legitimate medical treatment evolved into a systematic dismantling of an entire social class, transforming Europe's most powerful women into shadows of their former selves. The conspiracy of silence that protected these families ultimately enabled their complete annihilation, proving that wealth and status provide no immunity against the ravages of addiction. This hidden chapter reminds us that beneath history's most glittering surfaces often lie the darkest truths, forever changing how we view the price of perfection in any era.